First, I want to acknowledge the tremendous challenge of the last 6 to 8 months for not just the world, but particularly the city of Austin. I want to take a moment to create space for those of us who have lost loved ones during this time, due to the pandemic or otherwise, because no matter why the loss occurred, the pain and grief cuts a little more deep during this particular chapter of human history. Everything becomes amplified in times like these because we have been forced to go inside and stay home. This pause at home has pushed many to ask questions that they previously didn't have time to ask, see things they previously didn't have time to see, and feel things they previously didn't have time to feel. Spending more time away from the daily mundane rituals and activities that may distract us from our shortcomings as individuals or as a society has forced conflict and tension to rise to the surface. We have seen this tension manifest as protests in the streets and with direct calls for institutional change within federal and local government. There has been nowhere to run or hide for months, and collectively, residents have had to face many of the city's most prominent and troubling failures head on. For many in power, facing issues of inequity and the demands for change that come along with them feels like even more loss on top of the losses that COVID has directly wrought to our community's physical health. As Frederick Douglass stated, power concedes nothing without a demand. And while words have been expressed by those in power about confronting issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion directly, we see little concession to the demand for dramatic change thus far within the music sector regarding equity. How interesting is it that the virus, which slowed down the planet in 2020, attacks the respiratory system? The murder of George Floyd was literally a cutting off of his very ability and right to breathe. Isn't it interesting as well that the city of Austin declared racism to be a public health crisis in July 2020? This historic proclamation extensively documented that racism causes persistent discrimination and disparate outcomes in many areas of life, including housing, education, business, employment, and criminal justice. And an emerging body of research demonstrates that racism itself is a social determinant of health. More than 100 studies have linked racism to negative health outcomes. We can look at the Prosperity Institute's report, The Racial Wealth Divide in Austin, which states that despite all racial groups faring better than their respective counterparts nationally, we find that Black and Latino households still face a large measure of racial economic inequality in Austin, Texas. In 1980, Blacks made about 71% of the median income of whites, and Latinos made 82% of the white median income. Black and Latino median income in Austin declined compared to that of whites. So by 2016, Blacks only made 55% of white median income, and Latinos made 61% of white median income. I want to bring attention to that feeling of breathlessness, of loss, of anxiety about the future and your place in it. This is a feeling that the Black community in Austin knows better than any other. As a music community, we responded quickly to find emergency funds for musicians affected by the pandemic, but the traumatic and destructive virus of racism and white supremacy has yet to be addressed through policy or funding in the music sector. If the city is concerned about losing venues and businesses because they feel they are essential to the future of the live music capital, then that same energy needs to be held for the community that built so much of its wealth. We found $5 million for venues, and I asked the question, what will be found for Black musicians in Austin? What will be found for other historically marginalized communities of color? There is no Austin without us was the statement I shared via social media in June when I asked the Live Music Working Group to allot 50% of the $1.5 million for the needs of Black musicians in Austin via a Black Live Music Fund. This statement meant simply that the predominant genres played 24 hours a day and 7 days a week in Austin: rock, blues, country, jazz, funk, gospel, house, EDM, and hip hop, all derived from Black people. We, the Black community, have been essential workers, essential creators, essential fuel, essential inspiration, and essential providers during Austin's boom and subsequent recognition globally as a center for music, but have remained at the margins of benefiting from this boom. Iconic institutions like ACL and South by Southwest saw their boats raised for decades by the dramatic tidal wave of increased awareness and consumption of Austin's unique culture worldwide, all while, by and large, ignoring the Black community, culture, and genius that made their business models possible. There's no South by Southwest without us. There's no ACL without us either. More than 90% of the genres on display at these annual events come from Black people. There is not a single genre of music on the mainstream Billboard charts without us. This is not debatable. But where is the benefit from all this wealth generation? If none of these genres were ever created, would any of these music venues or events be possible? Could we even talk about a live music capital? The properties and buildings can't possibly be more important than the people, can they? That is one of the most important questions on the table today. If the city understands that venues must be preserved, certainly they can take the next logical step to understand that the culture upon which these venues' profits were built must be preserved as well. If we found $5 million for venues, what will we find for the historically neglected and disenfranchised communities of Austin? What are we willing to commit to make equity real and reforms robust? I suggest today, October 19, 2020, that we find a way forward with an annual investment of 50% of hot tax funds into PI funding for underserved communities. PI stands for Preservation, Innovation, and Elevation. Over the past several months, I personally received a great deal of feedback and input from the community via Music Commission meetings, Zoom calls, emails, and one-on-one conversations. The needs that I have heard expressed fit into these categories. When I hear leaders like unanimously speak about the legacy of Tejano music, or Harold McMillan reminding us of the failed social contracts involved in building a cultural heritage district for Black culture, I think about funds for preservation. Preservation is necessary so that we never lose our cultural foundations. The city can play a significant role to ensure that the legacies of historically underfunded and underserved communities will be preserved for future generations. Whether it's providing fundings for the history to be taught in the community through events, or for cultural traditions to be passed on through public workshops, or for infrastructural improvements to existing organizations and buildings, preservation leads to tourism because it develops placemaking opportunities in spaces that can be promoted and experienced year-round. Speaking with BIPOC musicians that are currently creating and developing their careers in Austin, issues center around access, marginalization, tokenism, and a general lack of visibility due to the current bias of venues, nonprofit organizations, talent bias, etc. As we witness many of the traditional models that upheld these biases waning and struggling to maintain relevance, the challenges can be addressed through a focus on innovation. Innovation models for funding need to go to organizations, artists, and businesses with visions for what the future can look like for historically underserved musicians in Austin. It is critical that money be in the hands of those most affected by racial discrimination and that they be given the opportunity to carve out their future with support from the city. The future of Austin's music scene is inextricably linked with its ability to create opportunities for its most marginalized members. Tourism will inevitably grow as a result due to the fact that innovation creates new opportunities for online and public spaces that will build new audiences previously untapped by traditional approaches of the past. Elevation means raising something up. If the historic and current contributions of BIPOC musicians are systemically erased, blurred, transfigured, and generally compromised, the future can only be altered through drastic change in the elevation of these groups. City funding applied to elevation should build pathways between tourism leadership, the economic development department, large-scale promoters, and underserved communities. Much more can be done with the already existing industry infrastructure to raise awareness about the music and culture coming from underrepresented groups and genres. Funding for elevation can be provided to BIPOC-led organizations and leaders that have ideas for building infrastructure that leads to greater awareness of the vibrant BIPOC music scene that currently exists. The goal of elevation is to move these groups from underrepresentation to equitable representation and opportunity across all areas of the music sector. While a rising tide economy does create more economic opportunities in an absolute sense, growth in and of itself does not automatically benefit the poor or reduce economic disparities amongst historically underserved groups, according to the Center for American Progress. Further, to secure our economic future, we need to begin developing a robust economic growth agenda that incorporates equity and achieves equitable outcomes. Creating opportunities for and elevating those most disenfranchised in our music community actually creates more tourism and economic growth. The future of the music sector depends on integrating everyone. According to research from Reimagine Race, Poverty, and the Environment, a journal of environmental and social justice, a superior growth model based on equity will grow new opportunities and bolster long-term competitiveness while ensuring that all, especially low income and people of color, have the opportunity to help create and benefit from that growth. The nation is undergoing a major demographic transformation in which racial and ethnic groups excluded in the past are becoming a larger portion of the population. New growth models must embrace these new demographics and make the necessary investment for the next generation to reach its full potential. Pulling from the stated mission of the Live Music Working Group to develop a framework for the effective use of hotel occupancy tax funds as appropriated for the commercial music sector by the City of Austin for the enrichment of Austin musicians, music venues, and music tourism through sustainable investment, we must see dramatic equity policy and fund allocation as a necessary investment for growth. I suggest today that we charge the Music Commission's newly formed Systemic Racism Working Group with the responsibility of determining how PI funding pulled from hot tax funds can best be managed and allocated to create economic growth in the commercial music sector. The Systemic Racism Working Group seeks to address structural inequity and racial inequality in Austin's music community through public discourse, distribution of funding, and policy change. By examining the development of Austin's music economy through the lens of race and the historic lack of support for our communities of color, we intend to provide recommendations to protect, repair, and build a more diverse and inclusive music scene. This committee is resolved to dive deeply into the various ways that race shapes policy and opportunity at all levels of the Austin music industry, venues, nonprofits, festivals, etc. So in terms of preservation, when I talk about funding, a funding model that prioritizes preservation, innovation, and elevation, I believe that 30% of whatever funding is pooled for that fund, for an equity fund, 30% of that should go to preservation. And I've written a bit about that. Investment in the historic cultural heritage of Austin music via funding that supports BIPOC-led organizations and individuals committed to preservation of the traditions and legacy of historically underserved communities through educational workshops and presentations that pass the legacy to new generations, development of cultural heritage district infrastructures, support of public cultural arts spaces, libraries, museums, etc., public events that celebrate BIPOC cultural heritage. In regards to innovation, which would be another 30% of funding, investment in the innovation of traditional business models that have excluded BIPOC communities via funding that supports BIPOC-led organizations and individuals committed to innovative and inclusive practices that build capacity in underserved communities through the incorporation of new media platforms, technology that develop the capacity of historically underserved communities and genres. The development of infrastructure that empowers the creation and development of tech-based business models that directly serve those most impacted by systemic racism. And the final piece, elevation, which is dealing with the current situation, the current artists that are making waves here in Austin, I suggest that we invest the most, which would be 40%. Investment in the elevation, education, and promotion of Austin music via funding that supports present BIPOC-led organization, talent, and musicians from historically underrepresented communities through partnerships with established global and national music brands, i.e. South by Southwest, ACL, to highlight the contributions of BIPOC Austin talent. Small business and entrepreneurial development via Economic Development Department. Creation of large and small-scale public events that specifically highlight BIPOC Austin talent. Grant funding that scales current successful projects and seed funding that incubates newer ones. Educational workshops focused specifically on overcoming the challenges faced by BIPOC artists in the Austin music sector. The Economic Development Department's Equitable Economic Resiliency Framework sets a historic precedent for a funding model that can be applied to hot tax funding, using the lens of race with priority given to the most economically vulnerable applicants for cultural arts funding. Under this model, 100% of funding is guaranteed to those most impacted by systemic racism. I believe this approach can be used as a model by the Systemic Racism Working Group to determine how hot tax funds can be used to create equitable outcomes in Austin music. I want to conclude with a few principles to lead a discussion about Austin's future into 2021 and beyond. Racial equity is the condition when race no longer predicts a person's quality of life outcomes in our community. As such, the City of Austin has recognized that race is the primary determinant of social equity. Moving this definition into the music sector, race is a primary determinant for the success of BIPOC musicians, and organizations. We can't afford to remain in the realm of awareness any longer. It's time to act, and city leadership must prioritize equity with the same energy that was allocated to saving venues and providing emergency funding to those affected by COVID-19. We moved on those things relatively quickly, but have left equity on the table for generations. Let's remember that our city budget is a moral document, and that the failure to provide clear direction is one that we can't afford if we intend to see sustainable growth into the future. Austin brands itself as a progressive destination city, and this is what progress looks like in 2020. It's not about theory and trending taglines. It's about resource allocation and economic redistribution.